For the longest time, I believed that this was the case. Now we could certainly define success in a variety of ways. Whether a person thinks of himself as successful is a highly personal matter. I go over the topic of how you might define success for yourself in some detail in my last book, Surrounded by Setbacks. So this time around, I'll settle for stating that the definition of success will vary depending on whom you ask. However, there will be interesting insights to consider. Different psychological tools associate an individual's core values with a variety of personal characteristics, and self-esteem is often one of them. A decade or so ago, an extensive study was carried out on subjects from a variety of professions, and my own self-analysis put me somewhere in the middle of the pack. My self-esteem is neither remarkably high nor alarmingly poor. It's fine. Just between you and me, I kind of expected and hoped to score higher. I asked my contact which professional group usually scored the highest for self-esteem. When I was prompted to guess, I suggested that maybe it was elite-level athletes, or perhaps corporate management at some of the larger or more well-known organizations. Professors holding prestigious positions at esteemed universities. You see, I associated strong self-esteem with actual achievement. My contact shook her head. The answer was something else entirely: pig farmers. They were, for all practical purposes, extremely content with themselves and felt that they had nothing to prove to anybody. They weren't at all interested in, say, what others might think of their chosen careers. According to this model, high achievers in most areas tend to be individuals with poor self-esteem who feel that they have a lot to prove. They're never satisfied with anything, so they keep working hard. Is this a good or a bad thing? It's hard to say. There is some correlation between self-esteem and quality of performance, but studies have shown that we may have gotten the wrong idea about how they are related. It seems that better performances lead to better self-esteem, rather than the other way around. I have to confess that my own assumptions about this were wrong all along. Now, success and achievement certainly aren't everything in life. People can be satisfied with far less, of course. Managing to avoid getting all worked up over nothing can also be taken as a measure of success. And if your self-esteem is strong, you'll probably find it easier to appreciate and be grateful for the things you already have. Besides, there are other factors at work here that are skewing these results. Young members of the upper classes, for example, tend to have better self-esteem and higher grade point averages than working class kids. Some individuals who struggle with their self-esteem are poor achievers, but this appears to be caused by childhood issues, such as living with parents who are addicts. Basically, it's difficult to identify any automatic connection between strong self-esteem and success. If a knack for self-admiration alone were a foolproof recipe for success and first-rate performance, young Americans, for example, would be world-class at just about everything they do. Young Swedes would be pretty amazing, too. The numbers don't differ that much. One study showed that 39% of American eighth graders felt strongly confident that they would pass their math classes, as opposed to just 6% of their South Korean peers. However, a comparison between the two populations' actual results reveals that the South Korean kids wiped the floor with their unfortunate American counterparts. The South Korean kids dominated Swedish kids, too. Student achievement is in decline in the West. Meanwhile, our kids keep growing increasingly confident each year. I'm happy for them, and I wish everybody could feel that way about themselves, but at the same time, I worry about their long-term prospects in life. It's hard to forge a career out of walking around feeling content with yourself. Life is probably going to place greater demands on them than that. Perhaps I'm being a bit too critical about this, but either way, this issue is undeniably a complex one. Let's boost everyone's self-esteem no matter what. What's the worst thing that could happen? The scientific method is our best approach for figuring out causal relations. It allows you to experiment with different kinds of treatment and see what happens. This is where things get really exciting. Because, of course, studies have been carried out on these things, too. Students whose achievements were average or below average were divided into two groups. Both groups were sent one email each week, which included a homework assignment for them to carry out. Group A received nothing but the assignment. No comments or explanations, just an admonition to get it done. The second group, B, received another email as well. which included messages that were intended to boost their self-esteem. For example, they were informed that people who perform poorly in some context often experience negative thoughts and hopelessness and feel inferior to their fellow students. A reference was made here to a fictional study, which suggested that students who had strong self-esteem didn't just get better grades, but also managed to maintain a high level of confidence. So, these students were encouraged to hold their heads up high and maintain high levels of self-esteem. Later, they retook the test. Sometimes it can be good for us to challenge our own preconceived notions. The results, you see, flew in the face of the researchers' expectations. Group A, who were given nothing but their assignments, achieved more or less the same results as before. No better and no worse. Group B, who had received the assignments alongside the weekly confidence-boosting messages, achieved significantly worse results. Their scores dropped from 57 points out of 100 to 37. Now, some of you may be thinking that Group B might have had lower self-esteem despite their weekly confidence boost. Perhaps it wasn't very effective, or maybe they simply didn't buy into what those emails were telling them. The research team wanted to find out too. So they decided to measure both groups' levels of self-esteem. Strangely enough, the students in Group B proved to be feeling very good about themselves. Their self-esteem had improved. Most significantly, they felt better than the first group, A, despite producing a far inferior performance. How can we explain this? After all, this can't exactly be welcome news to a culture that's so keen to inspire confidence and self-esteem in people. For the record, I wasn't very impressed when I first read this. You see, I've always been of the opinion that self-esteem is essential for good performance. Feeling good beats feeling bad every day of the week, there's no debating that. And still, I can't help thinking about this. The aspect that troubles me has to do with how this connects to narcissism. What conclusions should we draw from all this? Strong self-esteem, it seems, is something of a double-edged sword. It works very well up to a certain point, after which it can go off the rails. I can't stress this enough. I am not in any way claiming that we should be wandering around feeling insecure, disliking ourselves, and tearing our own confidence to shreds. All I'm saying is that paying a less excessive amount of attention to yourself and your thoughts isn't necessarily a bad thing. Being able to focus on the well-being of the group and invest time and effort into supporting others isn't necessarily evidence of deep self-loathing. It should be possible to succeed without having to overcome your own ego every time. After all, that's the whole point of the self-esteem movement. Cultivating your self-esteem has been fashionable for some time now, and I think it's essentially a good thing to accept and like yourself and think of yourself as deserving of a good life. But as we've seen, there are dangers, some of which can't be overstated. While working on this book, I discussed the subject of self-esteem with a whole load of people. Occasionally, I would end up in some rather heated debates. Some people seem to respond with particular rancor. Oh, we're supposed to go around hating ourselves now, are we? Is that what you're saying? No, that's not what I'm saying. The opposite of obesity isn't anorexia. There is a whole range of attitudes that lie somewhere between self-hatred and narcissism. Some people do walk around actively disliking themselves, and we need to help them. In any case, you can appreciate yourself without having to indulge in pathological, harmful self-infatuation. As I mentioned earlier, you'll know that you've gone too far when your self-centered focus starts to impact others. That will mean that you're straying dangerously close or have already crossed the line to narcissistic behavior patterns. You just might not know it yet. However, the case can also be made that you've actually gone too far the moment your behavior has consequences for someone else you may care a little about, yourself. Or, to put a generous spin on it, in case you're recognizing your own behavior in this, perhaps it's not all your own fault that you're in the particular mental state you are in today. There is a narcissistic culture that's gaining ground out there, and many researchers and psychologists are starting to raise the alarm. It's not entirely a matter of individual responsibility. Who knows? Perhaps you've been encouraged to believe that life will be easy and that you actually do deserve the best of everything without having to work for it. That no effort at all will ever be required from you, and that the world is terribly unfair for not giving you what you deserve. Sound familiar? If it does, you know what we're going to have to do next. Take a look at your parents. Normalizing narcissism. Sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. Friedrich Nietzsche at this point, I'd like to remind you what we're doing right now. We're trying to identify the causes behind what might be a proliferation of an increasingly narcissistic culture. A current trend in our part of the world is that first-time parents tend to be older now than they were a few generations ago. Many people stay in school longer, take sabbaticals to travel, work for a few years, or pursue self-fulfillment. Once all that is over and done, they're ready to move on to starting families. These days, it's not uncommon for first-time parents to be close to the age of 40, an unthinkable state of affairs as recently as the 1950s. Does any of this really matter, though? If you can keep up in purely physical terms, and if your financial situation is stable, couldn't it actually prove to be a good thing? It does seem like a much better option than becoming a parent at 17, after all. And while we must remain open to the truth that there are many competing views on this, a pattern nonetheless reveals itself. Anyone who has a child at the age of 40 will, naturally, have arranged their life in a specific way. They will have established their routines and a long list of habits, good and bad, that grow increasingly difficult to break as they grow older. A habit you've kept up for 20 years will be far more firmly entrenched than one you picked up 6 months ago. And to top it off, a 25-year-old will, on average, have more energy than a 40-year-old. Biologically, we should really be having children by the time we're 17 or 18. Relax, I'm not actually advocating that. I'm simply pointing out that this is what evolution seems to have designed us for. On the other hand, a 40-year-old is bound to have more life experience. Much more. They'll feel more self-secure and are also more likely to enjoy the financial stability needed to raise a child. They've learned to control their impulses. Hopefully, they've also learned to stay calm even when things get out of control. Small children have a way of making things do that. What makes an ideal parent? I have no idea. But I do know that the older you are when you have your first child, the fewer you'll be able to have. When I was a kid, Swedish families had an average of 2.1 children. This number dropped to 1.5 children per family, before rising again to just over 1.8 children per family. Only children have always been a thing, and they are growing more common. I have one sibling. My parents have three each. Their parents, on average, had six siblings each. What happened? Historically, a greater number of children was necessary to secure the family's livelihood, but as societies come to enjoy increasing wealth, the number of children born by each woman decreases. You can't argue with the data in this case. Nobody is trying to deny it. Increased wealth equals fewer children. In addition, almost every child survives childhood nowadays. In the poverty-stricken Sweden of the early 20th century, it was common for just 5 out of 10 siblings to make it to the age of 5. Child mortality dropped as our society's wealth increased. In Africa, child mortality recently reached the same levels that Europe saw in the 1950s. It's not something we often talk about, but genuine progress has been made in this regard. Now, you may be wondering what all this has to do with narcissistic culture. One theory might be that parents who have just the one child, rather than five, are more likely to attach a great deal of significance to the well-being of that child. I'm talking about 100% of their offspring, after all. What do people do when they only have one most cherished thing in life? Naturally, they try to take care of it in the best way possible. They protect it with everything they've got. They have zero tolerance for failure. This might be their only shot at this. So, they listen to their only child, look after them to the best of their ability, and try to satisfy all of the child's needs in a way that would have been unthinkable for parents just a century ago. There simply wouldn't be time for that in a family with 10 or more kids. Consider, then, that many who have been raised by parents who were older than average and tended to their children's every need have grown accustomed to receiving a great deal of attention. Ever since they saw the light of day, they've been surrounded by proof that they are the center of the universe, and there's no doubting how much they matter to their parents. Now they are adults, ready to make their way in the world and pursue happiness on their own terms. So, what does all this actually have to do with narcissism? The dangers of flying. During a long flight, my wife and I were in our seats, reading our books. Behind us was a woman, in the middle seat, who was traveling with a child who kept kicking the back of my seat. Anybody who has experienced this particular phenomenon knows that in the end, all you can think about will be those kicks to your seat. My wife turned around and asked the child to stop kicking the seat right this moment. The kicking ceased immediately. But the part that interested me was the mother's reaction. I heard her mumbling, "There's no need to be rude about it." Apparently, asking not to have to endure several hours of being kicked in the back is rude now. I'd like to add that my wife was not at all abrasive about it. She was as calm as ever, although admittedly, her eyes may have been a little intent. Why didn't the mother react? After all, she probably wouldn't have liked to have someone kick her seat like that. We never interviewed her about this. As we were disembarking the aircraft, however, I noticed her giving us some rather hostile looks. You would have thought we had slapped her child or something. How narcissistic tendencies are normalized. I have a memory from much earlier, when my daughter came home from daycare one day and announced that she was a princess. Stunned, I responded instinctively, "No, sweetheart, you're not." You might think that there's no harm in indulging your kids and playing along with their ideas that they are princesses, talented soccer stars, influencers, future reality TV stars, YouTube phenoms, or just the most fabulous creatures alive. Why not let them dream of playing for their favorite team with their favorite star? Or marrying a prince and receiving half the kingdom? What harm could it do? I agree that it might seem a bit excessive to get worked up over something like that. Until you think about it a little more, that is. Small children soon grow into bigger children. Before you know it, they're teenagers. During the late teens, a rather awkward phase that's rife with narcissistic behaviors begins, and the last thing any parent should want to do is let this get out of hand. Your objective is for the kids to grow up to be the best versions of themselves they can be. Of course, you want them to be strong and independent, but you also don't want to give them the wrong idea and make them think that the world is their oyster. The real paradox is this: how do you give your children everything they need without rob them of everything in the process? But let's start at the beginning first. How a simple t-shirt can be the beginning of the end. Very small children focus exclusively on themselves. Between the ages of 2 and 3, they begin to test boundaries, which marks the beginning of every parent's worst nightmare. The terrible 2s and 3s. They throw food around, throw tantrums on supermarket floors, give their siblings less than friendly taps to the head with toy trains, burst into tears at the slightest setback, refuse to go to bed, and offer a whole array of other charming displays. The conventional parental strategy for dealing with this used to be to resist as best you can, supporting each other as much as possible, and praying for some higher power to bring this phase to an end. Eventually, the kids grow out of it and return to more acceptable behavior patterns. A parent's job is simply to manage this challenge as best they can, for as long as it lasts. The last thing you want to do is reinforce the child's unruly defiance. This is why I find myself a little bemused whenever I see a child prance around in a t-shirt with the word princess printed on it, or boss, or I call the shots, or badass, or supermodel, or chick magnet, or future reality star, or even, I'm not making this up, spoiled. Why would you want to draw attention to how spoiled your kid is? Not too long ago, that would have been a source of undying shame for any parent. It was the kind of thing people said about other people's children. So and so is really spoiled. It was never a compliment. I get it. The point of those t-shirts isn't to produce a generation of spoiled children. And it seems evident that many people find a moderate helping of attitude to be quite adorable in a child. What harm could it possibly do? It's not as though the children themselves understand that there's anything strange about it. The target market for those t-shirts is really the parents. And some of the t-shirts are actually quite funny. However, let's discuss the one that had princess emblazoned across the chest. Let's say your daughter spends her entire childhood being told she is a princess, who ought to be regarded and treated as one. At what age exactly do you expect that she will spontaneously conclude that this is not a suggestion, that she is actually the long-lost heir to the throne of some far-off land? Or how about this? Assuming your daughter really is a princess, does that make you a king or queen? Perhaps all it makes you is a useful and loyal subject, bound to honor the princess's every wish. What's for dinner? A few years ago, I was in the supermarket, racking my brain and trying to remember what, if anything, was missing from our fridge back home. Next to me was a young father. His 3-year-old was crawling around on the floor. The dad asked his kid, "What should we have for dinner tonight?" I presumed the question was a rhetorical one, or that he was simply thinking out loud. Suddenly, the boy said, "Hot dogs." His father gazed at him in disappointment, sighed heavily, and wandered over to the refrigerator with the hot dogs. Whenever I think of this memory, I react the same way as I did at the time. Why on earth is a 3-year-old deciding what the family eats for dinner? My parents, who were kind, friendly, and caring in every imaginable way, would never have dreamed of putting my sister and me in charge of the menu. If we weren't in the mood for dumpling stew, that was tough, and we got dumpling stew all the same. Naturally, this didn't stop us from occasionally wishing that Dad would bring home a nice pork roast for Friday night. But if he didn't, dumpling stew it was. 20 years later, I was a parent myself. One of my own specialties is spaghetti bolognese. While my children were growing up, the whole family used to eat it. Only as an adult did my son, who is a chef today, reveal to me that he had never really liked my bolognese. That was disappointing to hear, of course, but he didn't seem to have suffered any serious trauma from eating it. These days, many families cook 1, 2, or even 3 different meals for dinner because of their children's particular wants and preferences. Homes are becoming more like high-end restaurants. Some families seem to think that the idea of everybody eating whatever is served is an outlandish concept. Would you like me to cut your sandwich for you? Do you want the crusts removed, or would you like it whole? Tell me how you want me to make it, or if maybe you'd prefer something else. I could make that for you, of course. Hold on, somebody will no doubt interject. Why shouldn't the kids get to say what they want to eat? Of course they can, what they want to eat, but they aren't necessarily experts on what they should eat. According to all available data, 7-year-olds tend not to be up to date on the most recent developments in nutritional science and can't really be expected to know why they should bother eating broccoli. Minerals, vitamins, and antioxidants are not very familiar concepts to them. Perhaps they like ketchup. Ketchup, however, is not a vegetable. The broccoli ends up being left on their plate because they find it hard work to eat. Mom and dad are exhausted by the challenges of their days and dreading the prospects of having to argue their way through another dinner. The kids, on the other hand, have nothing better to do. Their minds aren't preoccupied with any plans to read emails or get a load of laundry done before bedtime. They might even be looking forward to a refreshing round of the broccoli versus ketchup wars. So you give in. It's only human. I did it too, although I've since come to believe I was wrong. It seems to me that everybody does their best as parents. However, doing this teaches the children that what they want comes first. Just like narcissists, they're not going to back down. The same arguments can be made about all kinds of things: food, what to wear, when to go to bed, and what to watch on TV. In many families, the kids get to pick everyone's Friday night entertainment. Adults and children alike end up watching Disney movies. Nowadays, children get involved in family purchases to an extent that would have been unimaginable just 20 years ago. Vacation destinations, Christmas celebrations, what car to own. I'm not making this up. It's becoming increasingly common. 11-year-olds hold sway over purchasing decisions involving thousands of dollars. Naturally, people who give in to their kids in these situations aren't thinking it would be neat to have a kid who is a narcissist. But there has to be some limit to what a parent is willing to accept. The question, of course, is where to draw the line. I'm not going to pretend to know the answer to that. I probably made countless mistakes myself as a parent. All I can do here is indicate some of the risks involved in handing children too much power. Sometimes the responsibilities we give them can be quite significant. Maybe they should just get to be kids for a while. It seems unlikely that anybody can say for certain what the outcome would be if children were given too much influence or control. It's complicated. Helicopter parents. The term helicopter parents has seen increasing use in the last 30 years or so I thought I'd go over it briefly. It has often been suggested that making things too easy for your children spoils them and leaves them unprepared for life. If a boy becomes a man without ever having faced adversity, how will he cope? When adults continue to behave like children, their behavior is regarded as narcissistic. So, the hypothetical question here is this: is there any danger that a certain parenting style might exacerbate existing narcissistic dispositions in a child? One theory suggests that what we ought to do is take care of our children, nurture them, and protect them from obvious dangers, but not at the expense of training them for the challenges in life. They need to be prepared for anything the world throws at them, basically, one small step at a time. The other approach is to do everything in our power to protect our children. After all, they're small, they're fragile, and they could suffer if we make them face a challenge before they are ready for it. They should be protected from all the ills of the world for as long as it is possible. Eventually, they are bound to have to make their way in the world and overcome the dangers it involves. So, which is it? Do we need to hover over our kids, or is that the worst thing we could do to them? Parents used to be a lot more authoritarian. Traditional values like punctuality, hard work, loyalty, and protecting your family were still quite important, for better and for worse. Grown-ups respected children far less, physical discipline was still a thing, and kids were in danger of becoming withdrawn and inhibited. Kids were supposed to do as they were told, and when conflicts arose, parents weren't expected to reason with them. People were generally more confident in their roles as parents, and much more aware of the values they wanted to instill in their children. Parents today have a more democratic approach. Swedish parents, for example, reason with their children more than parents of any other nationality. Some people call this the intellectualizing approach to parenting. It often involves treating children as though they are far more mature than they actually are. How many parents have successfully talked their kids into going to bed by lecturing them on 5-year-olds and their need for sleep? I couldn't guess. How much good will it do to debate the utility of tying your shoelaces when it's snowing outside and your 4-year-old is already jumping up and down in the hall? Hard to say. Who can actually negotiate snack times with kids who know the cupboard is full of treats? No idea. Cultivating blindly. Is it so wrong, then, to give in to your child's wishes and demands? As usual, a research-based consensus has proven elusive here. For example, a Danish study suggests that children who receive excessive helicoptering at home don't actually fare worse in life, at least not in terms of subjective well-being. That makes sense. The children who are best prepared appear to be those who were helicoptered to some degree by their parents, but who also had to help out with a lot of chores around the house. A study like this will no doubt be received with a sigh of relief by many, as it offers partial confirmation that helping your kids won't necessarily do them harm. We should slow down at this point and make sure we've got our concepts straight. Helping your kids is a given, of course. Any parent who won't help their children is a pretty bad mother or father. But offering a reasonable degree of help isn't quite the same thing as eliminating all obstacles. The problem arises when we help our children so much that they never get a chance to learn to take care of themselves. There's always a middle ground between being overprotective and being neglectful. Should you prepare a sandwich for a 2-year-old? Probably. At what age should you expect them to make their own sandwiches? 3, 5, 12. You have to draw the line somewhere. How do things look towards the end of life? Here, we get the occasional reminder of what it was like to be a kid. In geriatric care, there is a common and pretty healthy philosophy. They say you should never do anything for somebody if they could do it themselves. Why not? Because it robs them of a great deal of their dignity. It disempowers the patient, who may stop trying altogether as a result. It can actually weaken their lust for life. This means, then, that being too helpful can in fact be harmful. Let them handle what they can on their own. Don't deprive them of their right to master their own worlds. When they aren't coping, intervene and give them your support. Of course, but if it's not necessary, it's undignified. Is there some reason why we should be treating our children differently? Should we allow them to cultivate their confidence as far as possible by encouraging them to take responsibility for themselves? For what it's worth, I find myself leaning this way. Now, we're not talking about making 5-year-olds get out and change the tires in pouring rain. We're talking about teaching them about cooperation and how to function as members of a family, the slice of society they are familiar with. To some extent, we're also actually talking about the fact that your 7-year-old is perfectly capable of making a sandwich. They probably know what the process involves. Not providing children with the things they need, however, is a sensitive topic, and discussions are prone to get heated. I'll probably get criticized for writing this, but it's only to be expected. However, if you feel provoked by this, you should know that it's actually a good thing that this is ruffling your feathers. That means that you're taking this seriously. But you need to consider the whole picture before you make up your mind. Some, although far from all, psychologists I know promote the idea that children are equally capable as adults when it comes to knowing what they need. They just don't know it yet. The parents, that is. Go back and read that sentence one more time. The kids know what they need as well as their parents do. How does this attitude make you feel? Perhaps this knowledge is somehow magically pre-programmed in them. If that were actually the case, maybe we would have sent them out to work instead of encouraging them to draw stick figures all day. The dangers of restaurant dining. I'm sure this sounds familiar to you. You've gone to a restaurant with your family. Perhaps it's a special occasion. You're enjoying yourselves, the food is great, and the service is everything you'd expect from an upscale establishment. There's a couple with a child at another table. This kid, let's say it's a 2-year-old, has come to this restaurant to explore. They're running around and making sure to take in all the sights. Soon, they start to yank at things and wander around among the tables, emitting loud exclamations of delight over everything there is to see. The first shriek of glee startles you, as you weren't expecting to hear that particular sound in a restaurant. Your husband or wife has already scoped the situation out and nods discreetly towards your right. That's where the culprits are seated. But maybe that horrific yell was a one-off thing. Surely, things are bound to quiet down in a moment. You don't quite believe yourself as you think this, however, and your instincts soon prove correct. The adorable little thing starts running around the tables and hollering again. The parents are so used to this noise that they hardly even react. Eventually, one of them gets up and herds the escapee back to their table. This marks the beginning of the true mayhem, however. The whole restaurant gets to enjoy the sounds of a violent tantrum followed by a torrent of tears. If things get really bad, the parent who tried to resolve the situation will be overcome by the ferocity of this assault and will simply release the child back to the floor, whereupon the whole scene will repeat itself. Now, imagine the same thing happening repeatedly throughout this child's early years and teens. Nobody is able to deal with this individual. Things simply turn out the way they turn out. Everybody plays along in order to keep things nice and simple. Narcissistic tendencies have been brought to life and nurtured. This isn't mere speculation on my part. This is exactly how the narcissistic child is going to behave once they're grown up. Tears, every parent's nightmare. Who can stand to see or hear a crying child? Our every instinct screams at us to pick them up, hug them, and tell them that whatever is troubling them will soon go away. However, if a child is never told no, there is a danger that their endearing little requests for treats on Tuesday evenings will evolve into an entitled expectation to be gifted a car in just a few years. Is it okay to tell your child not to do something that they shouldn't do, or that they can't have something they're asking for? Are children ruined for life if they have to endure a single moment of disappointment? Could they actually even learn an important lesson from it? When you tell them they can't drink Coca-Cola with their dinner, the message will get through after a while. I'm only saying this with such confidence because I've gone to the trouble of looking at the findings of child psychology researchers, rather than relying on mere opinion. There is endless documentation in support of the notion that all this is real, but it can certainly be a touchy subject. Back to the nightmare at the restaurant. Imagine if the child's mother or father had immediately told them to sit back down as soon as they left their chair. That's how you behave in a restaurant, right? Now, imagine that the child had already learned that there's no point in debating the matter, has grown comfortable with these firmly established boundaries, and is now at ease, free to investigate the contents of their dinner plate. Some of you are probably amazed that there are people who don't get this. All you have to do is set boundaries for your kid. Make a time investment at home over the course of a few months, and then it'll be smooth sailing from that point on. People have been doing it for millennia. Why wouldn't it work today? Other readers might be thinking that there's no way I've ever been in close contact with a 2-year-old. What 2-year-old can sit still for hours on end? No upbringing, no matter how perfect, can ever defy nature. Fair enough. But in that case, maybe you should consider waiting to go to a restaurant until you've worked this stuff out. An American study revealed that around 80% of the population felt that children were far too spoiled in general. Amusingly enough, a third of respondents also felt that their own children were spoiled. How about that? As I mentioned earlier, I'm no psychologist. On the other hand, you don't need to be a meteorologist to explain a thunderstorm. What we're still looking for here is an explanation for the increase in narcissism we're witnessing. It has to originate somewhere, after all. Maybe parents just suck. Every generation of parents that ever lived has been given a hard time over something or other that they got horribly wrong. My own grandparents were quite tough and demanding. They've certainly received their share of censure over that. But still, they managed to raise a reasonably functional generation. My parents, that grew up to be far nicer, more agreeable, and much more permissive than my grandparents. That generation, in turn, has been heavily criticized for what they did to their kids. Us. My own generation is even more permissive, sensitive, and inclusive, but only a fool could expect to escape history's judgment. In 50 years, it'll be our turn to be the idiots who didn't get it. How will my own children be raising my grandchildren? I don't have the faintest idea. Perhaps the next generation will simply leave their kids out in the yard and let nature take its course. They won't have any influence over anything anyway. All they did was have the children. What do they know? Whatever they do, they'll end up being told how wrong it was. All jokes aside, being a parent has never been a walk in the park. And everybody has their own idea of how it should or shouldn't be done. Maybe that's inevitable when what we're talking about is the most precious thing we have: our children. We didn't bring them into this world just so we could neglect them. The authoritarian parents of old, who felt no obligation to explain anything at all to their kids, have had to make way for a more modern, responsive approach to raising children. But as we've seen, we can get too much of good things like responsiveness. If you don't fully understand all the different aspects of a certain issue, it makes it difficult for you to make wise decisions about it. Power corrupts absolutely. In child psychology, the subject of power is sometimes mentioned, often in combination with the notion of abuses of power. Naturally, parents hold power over their children. They feed and house them. If you can't exercise power, there's really no way you can be a parent at all. Anything less would simply result in endless negotiations. And if nobody is allowed to hold power over anybody else, how come we so often see children exercising power over their parents? Are the less competent parties really supposed to hold authority over the more competent ones? Personally, I can't make any sense of it. It's like asking a new employee at the factory to instruct the CEO and owners on how they should be running the business. He could be a genuine, stand-up guy. He could even smell great. Maybe he's actually up to the task. Now, competence, or the lack thereof, has nothing to do with the value you assign to a particular person. There's no connection between the two. Everybody has value, of course, but not everybody is capable of doing the same things. Parental authority should be exercised in an intelligent, empathic way, with the objective of ensuring that the child gets what they need. The power of consistency. While I'm on the topic of power, I thought I might discuss the ultimate form of power: the power of consistency, which I touched on earlier in this book. As I said then, this involves first laying down the ground rules and then sticking to them. Come thunder, hail, or ice, you are going to remain resolutely committed to your original assertion that the kids are not going to be getting any Candy Tuesdays. Naturally, you'll have to consider the details of your decree before announcing it. Simply uttering whatever nonsense comes to mind and expecting the kids to obey will only prove futile. Since most people's behavior is glaringly inconsistent, this means that you'll be giving yourself a very strong card to play in interactions with your kids. Think it over. Give a response. Stick to it. It's so simple that it's almost ridiculous. But heaven knows it isn't easy. You also have the authority to do things the children don't get to do. Let's say you snuck yourself a piece of chocolate right before dinner. Your child notices and demands a piece of chocolate. Too, you got one, didn't you? Although you've admittedly made a bit of a mess of the situation, you can still say no. There's no need for any negotiations. You're the adult. You're allowed. Maybe you shouldn't really, but you're still allowed. It's always your responsibility. You enjoy different privileges than the children. You get to vote. You get to drive a car. You get to buy alcohol. You get to smoke. You even get to make more children. You're the adult, you're allowed. The idea that children are somehow harmed or traumatized for life by being refused privileges that adults are afforded seems strange to me. I've searched, but have not yet found any research to support that idea. Do we really need to be reflecting on whether it would be abusive of us to fail to give our children the maximum amount of agency and influence we possibly can? This is worth considering. Saying that children, young children in particular, have a limited capacity for understanding situations isn't the same thing as calling them completely useless or less valuable than adults. Once again, these are entirely separate things. As I see it, you have to keep your sense of a person's inherent value separate from your intellectual realization that this is an individual of flesh and blood who has their own particular blend of strengths and weaknesses. Stay in control of your parenting. Be the adult. You're entitled to call the shots in your own home. You're entitled to use the simple but oh so useful word no. It doesn't mean you love your children any less. It might even mean you love them more. If we adults aren't prepared to set boundaries for how we all cooperate to help society progress, who will? If you think I'm blowing this out of proportion, you could be right. But consider the alternative. Imagine a world in which everybody thinks of themselves as number one. How could that world even function at all? Test yourself. Are you a narcissist? In each of us, there is another whom we do not know. Carl Jung, the time has come for us to move on. After my discussion of cultural narcissism, you may have found yourself asking a natural question. What if I'm a narcissist? What if you are? This is a good question, and I should let you know up front that we all possess these traits to some degree. The question is simply to what degree. But does that make you a narcissist per se? Maybe it does, a little anyway. I don't suspect for a moment that you're really a narcissist in the clinical sense. It's highly unlikely that you would ever be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. I've already shown you the general criteria for a clinical diagnosis of narcissism. You probably recognized at least one or two of the criteria in yourself, and that can be enough to give some people pause. But just as nobody can deny that they sometimes procrastinate or get too preoccupied with something to be able to listen properly, or take the last bit of chocolate when nobody else is around, nobody can truthfully deny that they occasionally exhibit narcissistic behaviors. This is a complex issue. You're about to take the test that psychologists have been using to identify narcissistic traits for several decades now. This test is probably less than perfect, and it has detractors who claim it isn't fit for its intended purpose. But it can help us identify narcissist tendencies in people who wouldn't necessarily be diagnosed as full-on narcissists. In all likelihood, your personality does have a narcissistic element or two, but in order to be diagnosed with narcissism, you'd have to exhibit more of them, and more often. Sometimes you simply have to accept that you're not a saint. The benefit in doing so is that it can help you better appreciate your true potential. The test. Time to end the speculation and actually take the test. It begins on the next page.